The morning sun painted golden streaks across the sleek glass walls of Alexander Chen's penthouse office. At 38, he stood at his floor-to-ceiling window, watching the city wake up below him. His reflection showed a man who hadn't bothered to loosen his tie from yesterday, another all-nighter perfecting designs that most would have called perfect weeks ago. The wall behind his desk told his story better than any biography could. Awards from every prestigious architectural institution lined the shelves, gathering a thin layer of dust because Alex never had time to admire them. What caught the eye wasn't the awards, though. It was the small, worn photograph of his parents standing in front of their modest dry-cleaning shop 25 years ago. His phone buzzed for the 10th time that morning. Without looking, he knew it was his sister Grace trying to convince him to take a break. The company won't collapse if you take one weekend off, she'd been saying lately. But Alex knew better. Success was like a tower of cards. One wrong move, and everything could tumble down. Walking over to his design table, he ran his fingers across the blueprints of his latest project. A revolutionary skyscraper in Singapore that would actually clean the air around it. The design used cutting-edge technology to absorb carbon dioxide and convert it into clean energy. It was impossible, everyone said. That just made Alex work harder. His assistant knocked softly before entering with his usual morning coffee. "Sir, the board is waiting in the conference room for the quarterly meeting." Alex had forgotten about it entirely. These days, he measured time not in hours or days, but in progress made on his designs. In the conference room, faces both concerned and admiring turned to watch him present. Alex moved through his presentation with the precision of a surgeon, explaining how his latest innovation would change the future of sustainable architecture. The board members nodded, impressed but also worried about the project's ambitious scale. "The Singapore project will be my legacy," Alex declared, his quiet voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. What he didn't say was how every successful project felt like another step toward proving himself worthy of his parents' sacrifices. They had left everything behind in China, worked 16-hour days at their small shop just so he could attend the best architecture school. Later that evening, as the office emptied, Alex stayed behind. The city lights twinkled below like fallen stars. His phone buzzed again. Grace, this time with a photo of her kids at their school play. He smiled briefly but didn't reply. Family dinners, dates, friendships, they'd all felt like luxuries he couldn't afford. Not yet. Not until he had built something truly meaningful. In his private bathroom, Alex splashed water on his face and stared at his reflection. Dark circles under his eyes told the story of countless sleepless nights. His mother would have scolded him, told him to eat more, rest more. The thought made his chest tight. 5 years since they'd passed away, and still, every triumph felt hollow without them there to share it. He returned to his desk, where a model of the Singapore skyscraper stood like a prophecy of greater things to come. Its spiraling form represented everything he'd worked for: innovation, sustainability, perfection. Running his fingers along its edges, Alex felt the familiar surge of purpose that drove him. This building wouldn't just touch the sky, it would heal the earth below it. As midnight approached, the cleaning staff found him still at his desk, surrounded by sketches and calculations. They were used to it by now. The billionaire architect who lived more in his designs than in the real world. What they didn't see was the little boy who still heard his father's words. "In America, son, you can touch the sky if you work hard enough." Tomorrow, he would fly to Singapore for a site inspection. Another city, another project, another step toward a legacy that might finally feel enough. The night deepened around him as he worked, alone in his tower of glass and steel, dreaming of touching the sky. The Singapore morning was thick with humidity as Alexander Chen walked through his construction site. Around him, the skeleton of his dream reached toward the clouds, steel beams and concrete floors forming the beginnings of what would be his masterpiece. The sound of welding and heavy machinery filled the air. A symphony he had grown to love over years of building his visions into reality. The environmental systems will be installed on level 40 next week, his site manager explained, holding up a tablet with the latest progress reports. Alex nodded, but his attention was drawn to a section of the building where something looked off. The angles weren't quite right, at least not to his trained eye. "I need to check the western platform," he said, already moving toward the temporary elevator. His team tried to convince him to wait for the safety inspection scheduled for later that day, but Alex had never been one to delay when he sensed a problem. "It'll only take 5 minutes," he assured them, stepping into the construction lift. The platform in question hung 60 stories above the ground, offering a view that would have taken anyone's breath away. But Alex wasn't there for the view. He moved carefully along the temporary structure, his expensive shoes collecting dust as he examined the connection points. The morning sun cast strange shadows through the scaffolding, making it harder to see the details he was looking for. That's when he'd heard it, a sound no architect ever wants to hear on their site. A metallic groan, followed by the sharp crack of failing supports. Time seemed to slow down as the platform beneath his feet shifted. His mind, always so quick with calculations and solutions, could only register one thought: this wasn't supposed to happen. The world turned sideways, then upside down. The platform gave way completely, and Alex felt himself falling. Wind rushed past his ears. His hands reached out desperately for anything solid, finding only air. Through some miracle, his fallen body caught on a lower section of scaffolding, turning what would have been a fatal drop into something survivable, barely. The impact knocked all the air from his lungs. Pain exploded through his body, but it was the strange sensation in his eyes that terrified him most. Everything was too bright, then too dark, then blurry in a way that felt permanent. He could hear voices shouting, sirens wailing in the distance, but it all seemed to come from very far away. The next few hours passed in a blur of emergency rooms and urgent voices. Words floated around him: optical nerve damage, severe trauma, surgery required. Grace's voice appeared somewhere in the chaos, probably through a phone, telling him she was on her way from New York. But Alex could barely focus on any of it. The world had become a smeared painting, shapes without definition, colors without borders. In the hospital room, doctors explained the reality of his condition. The impact had severely damaged his optical nerves. "You've retained about 20% of your vision," they said, their voices gentle with practiced sympathy. "The damage is likely permanent." Alex heard the words, but couldn't quite process them. How could he, Alexander Chen, the man who lived through his eyes, who saw beauty in every angle and line, be left in this blurred twilight? The following days brought a parade of specialists, each offering different treatments and possibilities. But the core truth remained unchanged. His world would never again be the clear, precise place he had known. Simple tasks became mountains to climb. Reading was nearly impossible. The screens he had worked on for countless hours were now just glowing blurs. At night, when the hospital grew quiet, Alex would lie awake, trying to make sense of his new reality. He thought about his building, still reaching toward the sky without him. He thought about his parents, wondering if they could see him now, wondering what they would say about this cruel turn of fate. The darkness around him felt infinite, not just in his eyes but in his soul. Grace arrived on the third day, her presence both a comfort and a reminder of everything he stood to lose. She tried to talk about rehabilitation, about adapting, about finding new ways to work. But Alex could barely stand to hear it. How could he adapt when everything he had ever been was built on his ability to see, to envision, to create? The Singapore skyline glittered outside his window, or so the nurses told him. To Alex, it was just a wash of dim lights and shadows, like a watercolor left out in the rain. His perfect world of clean lines and precise angles had dissolved into this impressionist nightmare, and he had no idea how to find his way back. The elevator doors opened to Alexander Chen's New York penthouse, but he barely recognized the space he'd once known better than his own reflection. His sister Grace guided him inside, her hand gentle on his elbow. A touch he wanted to shake off but couldn't, not unless he wanted to bump into another wall. The 45-minute journey from the airport had already left him exhausted and humiliated. "I've hired a home care assistant," Grace said, her voice trying too hard to sound cheerful. "Just temporarily, until you get your bearings." Alex's jaw tightened. Getting his bearings, as if this was just some minor setback, like a sprained ankle or a bad cold. The assistant was a quiet woman who spoke with a slight Filipino accent. She tried to explain how she'd organized his medications, but Alex cut her off. "I can manage," he said, even though they all knew he couldn't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Board members, project managers, clients, all wanting to know when he'd return, all pretending this was just a brief interruption in business as usual. Alex had his assistant send out a brief message postponing all meetings indefinitely. The word indefinitely felt like acid in his mouth. Night and day blurred together in his dimmed world. Grace had installed some kind of automated system that announced the time every hour, but Alex often lost track anyway. Sleep came in restless bursts, haunted by dreams of falling, of buildings crumbling, of his parents looking at him with disappointment in their eyes. One morning, or maybe it was afternoon, Alex found himself in his home office. His fingers traced the edge of his design table, now useless to him. The sophisticated 3D modeling computer that had been his primary tool might as well have been a child's toy. He could barely make out the blurred shape of his awards on the wall, those precious symbols of success now just gathering dust. The board called again, Grace said from the doorway. They need decisions about the Singapore project. Alex turned toward her voice, his movement uncertain in a way that made him hate himself. Tell them to do whatever they want, he said, his voice flat. I'm clearly not in a position to make decisions anymore. Grace stepped closer. Alex, this isn't you. You've never given up on anything in your life. The concern in her voice made him angry. Well, maybe it's time I learned how, he snapped. Since I can't exactly design buildings when I can barely find my way to the bathroom. The days stretched into weeks. Alex refused the rehabilitation specialists Grace tried to arrange. What was the point? His world had been visual, every sketch, every blueprint, every model. Now it was all just a blur of shapes and shadows. He spent hours sitting in his living room, listening to the city below, a city full of buildings he could no longer see clearly. His company's stock prices were falling. He knew because Grace stopped trying to hide it from him. The Singapore project, his dream of creating a building that could heal the earth, was being redesigned by others. They sent him documents he couldn't read, asked for approvals he couldn't give. Each day brought a new reminder of his uselessness. The home care assistant, he still couldn't bring himself to use her name, tried to teach him ways to navigate his space. Everything had to be in exact positions. His clothes were organized by color and texture. His meals were arranged like a clock face, but every small victory in this new world felt like an admission that the old one was gone forever. At night, when the city's noise died down, Alex would stand by his window. He could make out the vague shapes of buildings he had once admired in crystal clarity. Sometimes he pressed his forehead against the cool glass, remembering how it felt to look at a blank sky and see not emptiness, but possibility. Now all he saw was darkness, inside and out. Grace kept trying to reach him, putting photos of her kids, telling him about their lives, trying to pull him back into the world of the living. But Alex retreated further into himself. He stopped answering his phone, ignored the doorbell, let his beard grow. What was the point of maintaining appearances when he could barely see his own reflection? The final straw came when he tried to sketch. His hands, once so sure and precise, now moved blindly across the paper. The lines were wobbly, uncertain, like a child's drawing. In a rage, he swept everything off his desk, hearing the satisfying crash of objects hitting the floor. Then he sank down among the debris of his old life, finally allowing himself to cry for everything he had lost. The knock on Alexander Chen's door was different this time, sharp, purposeful, almost commanding. He ignored it, just as he'd ignored every other knock for the past 3 weeks. But this visitor wasn't taking no for an answer. Mr. Chen, a woman's voice called out, her tone carrying no trace of the sympathy he'd grown to hate. You've missed our last 3 scheduled appointments, so I decided to bring the mountain to Muhammad, as they say. Alex stayed silent, hoping she'd leave. Instead, he heard the door open. Grace must have given her a key. Footsteps approached, confident and steady. I'm Dr. Sophia Martinez, the voice said, now closer. And you're sitting in the dark at 2 in the afternoon, which isn't helping your remaining vision at all. Without waiting for his response, she walked across the room and opened the curtains. Light flooded in, making Alex wince. I didn't ask for a house call, he said, his voice rough from disuse. No, you didn't. You also didn't ask to fall from a building, but here we are. There was something refreshing about her bluntness. No pity, no carefully chosen words. Your sister hired me because I'm the best at what I do. Whether I help you or waste my time is up to you. Alex turned toward her voice. In his blurred vision, he could make out the shape of a woman in what seemed to be a blue dress. And what exactly do you do, Dr. Martinez? I help people like you remember they're not dead. She moved around his living room, picking things up. Right now, you're doing everything wrong. The way you're arranging your space, how you're avoiding light, how you're letting your other senses get lazy, it's like you're trying to fail. Her words stung, but they also sparked something he hadn't felt in weeks: anger. I'm a visual person. My whole life, my work, everything I am is based on what I can see, or could see. Oh? Sophia's voice came from another part of the room now. So you never used touch to understand the texture of materials? Never listened to how sound travels through a space? Never felt the flow of air in a well-designed building? She paused. For a brilliant architect, you're thinking very one-dimensionally. Alex stood up, wobbling slightly. You don't understand. My father was blind, she cut him off. Not partially like you, completely blind. He was a musician. When he lost his sight, people said he'd never play again. Know what he did? He learned to feel the music instead of reading it. He became better than he ever was before. Something about her story made Alex pause. How? He adapted, he evolved. He stopped focusing on what he'd lost and started discovering what he could gain. She was moving again, rearranging things. You have 80% vision loss, which means you still have 20% left. Plus, you have all your other senses, your knowledge, your experience. The only thing holding you back is your refusal to adapt. Over the next hour, Sophia showed him how wrong his approach had been. She taught him about contrast and lighting, explaining how to maximize his remaining vision. She rearranged his furniture to create clear paths, showing him how to use tactile markers to navigate. Architecture isn't just visual, she said as she guided his hands along the wall. Feel this. The texture, the temperature, the way it carries sound. These are all part of how people experience space. You've always known this, you just never had to rely on it before. To his surprise, Alex found himself engaged. Sophia's methods were unconventional. She made him close his eyes completely and walk through his apartment, teaching him to use echolocation. Listen to how sound bounces off different surfaces, she explained. Each material has its own acoustic signature. When he stumbled, she didn't help him up. You'll learn faster if you pick yourself up, she said matter-of-factly. Her tough love approach was exactly what he needed, though he wasn't ready to admit it. By the end of the session, Alex was mentally and physically exhausted, but something had shifted inside him. Sophia had shown him possibilities he hadn't considered, ways of experiencing architecture that he'd always known about but never truly understood. Same time tomorrow, she said, gathering her things. It wasn't a question. And Mr. Chen? Take a shower and shave. You're an architect, not a castaway. As the door closed behind her, Alex stood in his newly rearranged living room. For the first time in weeks, he felt something other than despair. It wasn't hope exactly, not yet, but it was a crack in the darkness, a hint that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. He ran his hand along the wall, feeling the supple texture of the paint, listening to the way his footsteps echoed in the space. These were things he'd always known about but never truly appreciated. Now they felt like clues to a new way of understanding the world he'd thought he'd lost completely. That night, before going to bed, Alex did something he hadn't done in weeks. He set an alarm for tomorrow. The morning sun streamed through the window as Alexander ran his fingers across a textured model. 3 weeks of working with Sophia had changed everything, including how his home office was set up. Gone were the sleek digital screens, replaced by physical models with enhanced tactile features. Tell me what you feel, Sophia said, standing nearby. Her voice had become a familiar comfort over these sessions, though she was still as demanding as ever. The surface changes here, Alex said, his fingers finding a supple pattern. It's like waves in sand. He moved his hands carefully, mapping the structure in his mind. The texture guides people naturally toward the entrance. Good, Sophia replied. Now close your eyes completely. What does the space tell you? Alex had learned to trust this process, strange as it still felt sometimes. With his eyes closed, his fingers detected details he might have missed even with perfect vision. The patterns create rhythm. It's not just decorative, it's a language anyone can read through touch. Working with Sophia had opened his mind to a whole new way of experiencing architecture. She pushed him to use all his senses, to understand buildings as more than just visual objects. Some days were still hard. He'd catch his blurred reflection in a window and feel that old despair creeping back. But Sophia never let him wallow. "I have a proposal for you," she said one afternoon after a particularly good session. "There's a community center project. They need someone who understands design from a different perspective." Alex hesitated. "I haven't taken on any new projects since." "Since you decided to hide in your tower?" "Yes, I noticed." Sophia's directness still caught him off guard sometimes. "This is different. It's a center for visually impaired children. Who better to design it than someone who understands their experience?" The idea took root in his mind. That night, unable to sleep, Alex found himself at his workbench, doing something he hadn't done since the accident, sketching. His lines weren't perfect anymore, but they didn't need to be. He was designing with all his senses now. Days turned into weeks as Alex threw himself into the community center project. He created surfaces that told stories through touch, spaces that sang with carefully crafted acoustics. Sophia visited daily, offering guidance both professional and personal, though Alex noticed she kept a careful distance despite their growing connection. "The children will love this," she said one evening, running her hand along a model of a wall designed to create different sounds when touched. The pride in her voice made his heart skip a beat. "I couldn't have done this without you," Alex said softly. The room felt different suddenly, charged with something neither of them was ready to name. Sophia cleared her throat. "It's all you. I just showed you the door." But she lingered longer than usual that evening, discussing ideas, sharing stories about her father, laughing at Alex's attempts to cook dinner in his adapted kitchen. The community center project became more than just a building. It was a bridge between his old life and his new one. Alex learned to trust his other senses, to feel the soul of a space rather than just see its surface. His remaining vision, combined with his enhanced understanding of touch and sound, gave him a unique perspective that neither fully sighted nor completely blind architects had. One morning, Sophia arrived to find Alex excited about a new innovation. "Listen," he said, leading her to a corner of his workspace. He tapped different panels, each producing a distinct sound. "The acoustics tell you exactly where you are in the building. No signs needed." Sophia was quiet for a moment. "You've come so far," she said finally, her voice soft with an emotion he hadn't heard before. "We've come far," he corrected her. Their hands touched briefly over the model, and neither pulled away immediately. The moment stretched, full of unspoken possibilities. But Sophia stepped back first, professional mask sliding back into place. "We should focus on finalizing the plans," she said, though her voice wasn't quite steady. Alex understood her hesitation. He'd learned enough about her to know she kept strict boundaries with her patients. But he also knew that what was growing between them had nothing to do with patient and doctor anymore. As they worked late into the evening, their conversations drifted from architecture to life, from professional to personal. Sophia told him about growing up watching her father overcome challenges, about her own journey to help others do the same. Alex shared stories about his parents, about the drive that had both made and broken him. The community center was nearly complete in design, but something else was just beginning. In learning to see the world differently, Alex had started to see Sophia too, not just as his rehabilitation specialist, but as someone who had helped him build a bridge back to life. That night, after Sophia left, Alex stood in his living room, listening to the city sounds floating up from below. He touched the textured wall, smiling at how natural it felt now. In losing his perfect vision, he'd gained a deeper way of seeing, and maybe, just maybe, a chance at something he'd never known he was missing. The call came at midnight. Alex was in his home office, working on final touches for the community center when his phone rang. Grace's voice was tight with worry. "Turn on the news," she said. "It's about Singapore." With his adapted tablet, Alex pulled up the newsfeed. Even with his limited vision, he could make out the headlines. "Structural concerns halt revolutionary skyscraper project." His heart sank as he listened to the report about potential design flaws in his former masterpiece. "The board is meeting in an hour," Grace said. "They're on video conference. They need you, Alex." He almost laughed. Need me? I can barely see the screen. Then don't use your eyes. Sophia's voice suddenly cut in. Grace had patched her into the call. Use everything else I've taught you. The next hour was a blur of preparation. Sophia arrived at his penthouse, helping him set up for the video conference in a way that would work with his limited vision. She arranged the lighting, positioned the screens, made sure all the project documents were accessible through his adaptive software. Remember, she said, squeezing his shoulder, you know this building better than anyone. You dreamed it before you ever drew it. The board meeting started with tense introductions. The new project lead in Singapore explained the issues. Unusual vibrations in the structure, concerns about the environmental systems integration. As they shared technical data, Alex closed his eyes, letting his other senses take over just as Sophia had taught him. Show me the structural models, he said, not the computer renderings, the physical ones. There was confusion, but they complied. Through his tablet's enhanced video feed, Alex could make out enough of the physical model to combine it with his memory and other senses. Turn it, he instructed. Let me hear the acoustics tests. Sophia watched silently as Alex worked, her presence giving him strength. For 2 hours, he led them through a different kind of analysis, one that relied on all senses, not just sight. He had them test sound patterns, airflow, material responses. There, he said finally, the issue isn't in the main structure. It's in the connection points between the environmental systems and the core. The vibrations are telling us something the visual inspections missed. The room went quiet. The chief engineer in Singapore ran some calculations. He's right, she said finally. The connection points are creating harmonic resonance we didn't account for. But how did you? Sometimes you'd have to close your eyes to really see, Alex said, feeling Sophia's smile without needing to see it. The crisis wasn't over, but they had a direction now. As the meeting wrapped up, the board members were looking at Alex differently. Not with pity anymore, but with renewed respect. After everyone signed off, Sophia brought him a cup of coffee. Their hands touched as she passed the mug, and this time neither pulled away. Thank you, Alex said softly, for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. Sophia sat next to him, closer than she usually allowed herself. I should maintain professional distance, she said, but her voice wavered. I shouldn't be here this late. I shouldn't. Alex turned toward her, his hand finding hers with surprising certainty. I'm not your patient anymore, he said quietly. I haven't been for a while. The moment stretched between them, full of possibility and fear. Sophia had spent her career helping people rebuild their lives, keeping careful boundaries. But Alex had become more than just another success story. My father, she said finally, her voice barely a whisper, he always said that losing his sight helped him see what really mattered. Her hand trembled slightly in his. I've spent years helping others find their way back to life, but I've been afraid to really live my own. Alex smiled, hearing the echo of his own journey in her words. Then maybe we both need to learn to take some risks. The night deepened around them as they talked, really talked, for the first time not as doctor and patient, but as two people who had helped each other see the world differently. Sophia shared her fears about loving someone as driven as Alex, about mixing her professional and personal lives. Alex spoke of his terror of depending on anyone, of showing weakness. Dawn was breaking when they'd finally ran out of words. They stood by Alex's window, his arm around her shoulders, watching the city wake up through their different ways of seeing. The community center opens next week, Alex said. Be my date for the ceremony? Sophia laughed softly. Someone has to make sure you don't bump into any walls. I haven't bumped into anything in weeks, he protested. Because I arranged your entire apartment. Their laughter mixed with the morning light, a promise of something new beginning. The Singapore crisis had shown Alex that he could still contribute, still create, still matter. But Sophia had shown him something even more important, that sometimes life's greatest designs aren't buildings at all, but the connections we build with each other. The community center buzzed with excitement on opening day. Children ran their hands along the textured walls, their faces lighting up as they discovered how the building spoke to them through touch and sound. Alexander Chen stood at the back of the main hall, listening to their delighted laughter, seeing the success of his design in a way no vision could capture. Sophia stood beside him, her hand quietly finding his. Ready for your speech? she asked. The past year had changed them both, him learning to see the world differently, her learning to let love into her carefully structured life. For the first time, Alex said, "I actually am." He walked to the podium without assistance, having memorized every step of the building he'd designed with all his senses. The room quieted as he began to speak. "A year ago, I thought my life was over," he started, his voice carrying clearly through the acoustically perfect space. "I was an architect who could barely see, a man who measured his worth by what his eyes could do. I was wrong about so many things." He gestured to the space around them. "This building isn't just accessible, it's alive. The walls don't just stand there. They tell stories. The floors don't just support you, they guide you. The spaces don't just contain you, they embrace you. I couldn't have designed this before my accident. I couldn't have understood what architecture truly means." In the audience, he could make out Grace's blurred figure sitting with her kids. His sister had been right all along. This wasn't the end, just a different beginning. Next to her sat members of his firm's board, who had watched his journey from skepticism to amazement as he revolutionized their approach to design. "But this journey wasn't just about architecture," Alex continued. "It was about learning that our limitations often become our greatest strengths. It was about understanding that sometimes we need to lose our old vision to find a new one." His voice softened as he turned towards Sophia's direction. "And sometimes we need someone brave enough to show us the way." After the speech, Alex and Sophia walked through the building, stopping to talk with families and children. A young girl tugged at Alex's sleeve, eager to show him how she already learned to navigate by the different sounds each corridor made. Her mother had tears in her eyes as she thanked him. Later that evening, in the quiet of his penthouse, their penthouse now, Alex and Sophia sat looking out over the city. The Singapore project was back on track, incorporating many of the sensory design elements they'd pioneered in the community center. His firm had created a new division focused on inclusive architecture, with projects lined up around the world. "I have something to show you," Sophia said, taking his hand and leading him to his old design table. There, she placed his fingers on a small model, a wedding chapel. "I thought maybe we could design this one together." Alex smiled, his fingers tracing the curves of the small structure. "It's perfect," he said, pulling her close. "A place where all senses come together to celebrate love." The next few months were a whirlwind of preparation, both professional and personal. They'd launched a foundation supporting education for visually impaired architects, combining Sophia's expertise in rehabilitation with Alex's architectural knowledge. The wedding chapel took shape, incorporating everything they'd learned about how to make a space speak to all the senses. On their wedding day, the chapel was filled with music that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Textures guided guests along paths that felt as natural as breathing. Scents from carefully placed gardens drifted through perfectly designed air currents. It was architecture that could be experienced with every sense, a physical embodiment of their journey together. Alex stood at the altar, listening to Sophia's footsteps as she walked toward him. He didn't need perfect vision to see her beauty. It was in the sound of her movement, the subtle change in the air as she drew near, the warmth of her presence as she took his hand. They had written their own vows, promises that spoke of seeing with the heart, of building a life that transcended traditional boundaries, of finding strength in what others might see as weakness. As they spoke these promises, their voices carried perfectly through the space they had designed together, reaching every guest with crystal clarity. At the reception, Alex's sister Grace raised a toast. "To my brother, who taught us that sometimes our greatest setbacks lead to our greatest comebacks. And to Sophia, who showed him how to see with more than just his eyes." Later that night, after the guests had gone, Alex and Sophia stood in their chapel. The space hummed with the echoes of celebration, with the promise of new beginnings. Through his partial vision, Alex could make out Sophia's silhouette in the gentle light, but he saw her most clearly with his heart. "What do you feel?" Sophia asked, using the same words she'd used in their first sessions together, but now they carried a deeper meaning. "Everything," Alex replied, drawing her close. "I feel everything." As they stood there, surrounded by the space they'd created together, they both knew that this was just the beginning. There would be more buildings to design, more lives to touch, more boundaries to break. But most importantly, there would be more moments like this, moments where love and vision came together in perfect harmony, creating something greater than either of them could have imagined alone.